All right, election fraud. Let me say this about election fraud. For the last 10 years, I've been amazed at the outrage displayed by each side, Democrats, Republicans. Um, the claims, that of fraud are raised, and they treat it like somebody insulted your grandmother's virtue. Like, how dare you question the integrity of our voting rules, and there's no fraud. And I'm scratching my head because I'm like, I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and I'm Irish. We invented fraud. I mean, election fraud, voter fraud was a pastime in Illinois, in Chicago. It still is, frankly. There is no Republicans in the city. Right? Now, am I saying that's right or wrong? No, no. I will say this though: the city figured out how to make it work. Yeah, there was ghost payrolling. There was all kinds of waste. Right? Um, they let the pensions go way too long without fiscally trying to do something about it. But if you were going to do that, you'd have to you know uh, cut some costs somewhere else. And in politics, that's a tough thing to do, and particularly in a Democrat city like that. But I will say, I lived in Chicago in the '70s when downtown was a shithole, for lack of a better term. At 5 o'clock on a Friday, you could have shot a cannon down State Street in 1975, and no one would have noticed. Right? It was horrible. But by the mid '90s, it was one of the most beautiful cities to live in, one of the most beautiful cities to visit for tourism. They had the Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. They had the Blackhawks and their runs. The Chicago Cubs finally won a thing. I was a season ticket holder with the Chicago White Sox. We won a World Series. The city was rocking. I love Chicago. I mean, I lived there my whole life. Grew up in the city. I loved it. I loved the history of it. I spent I spent hours boring my kids to death, driving them around the city and pointing out where famous things happened. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and this is where the Pullman House was, and this is where Montgomery Ward lived, and this is where you know any famous person in Chicago, history. I knew it. I knew where they lived, and so I love Chicago. And the mayors who ran Chicago, they may not have been completely above board, but they managed to make it work, and they managed to make it a well-run, beautiful place, even all the way up until the end of Rahm Emanuel's term as mayor. I think when COVID hit, and I won't call it protesting. It was nothing but riots. I lived in a high rise on Michigan Avenue, one of the most magnificent mile, the most beautiful streets in the world, much less the United States. And every single window was being broken, and people were looting out of all of the high-end stores, and police were standing on street corners being told to do nothing. And all I said at the time, and all everyone I knew would say was, it never would have happened under Rahm. Right? Rahm Emanuel was a Democrat, but he wasn't stupid. And I think Rahm has been smart enough to come out, at least, and say, hey, you got the wrong idea here. If you want to run a good city, you got to keep the people safe. You got to make sure they feel safe. So you can't tell them they're safe. You actually have to make them feel that they're safe. There's a difference. That's the difference between the mayor now and the mayor when Rahm was there. You got to let the police do their job. Okay, you have to let the police do their job, because otherwise, your people won't be safe. And you got to take out the garbage, and you got to shovel the snow. So you get those three things done, right? And there's a whole hell of a lot you could do with the city. And you can't ignore business, right? Not only can you not ignore them, but in the case right now, since Emanuel left the city of Chicago, they haven't just ignored business. They've purposely, tried to get rid of businesses. Okay, they treat them like absolute crap. One of the single worst things that happened in the city of Chicago in the last 10 years was Ken Griffin leaving. Ken Griffin, a hedge fund called Citadel, brought the hedge fund business to Chicago. But more than that, he was donating to all the museums hundreds of millions of dollars. He donated the bike trail flyover in Chicago. So if you're from the city, you know what that is. It was a congested section. You could now ride your bike from one end of the city to the other without any stopping. He paid for it out of his own money. Right? He loved that city and was treated like an absolute dog. And then once the crime hit, because he lived a block away from me, I know this, I saw the crime hit too. He said enough's enough and got out. If Rahm Emanuel had been mayor when COVID hit, I wouldn't be spending 7 months out of the year living outside of Nashville, Tennessee, instead of paying my taxes there, instead of my forever home that I thought I lived in Chicago back in 2019 and 20. Right? It's a different place. It's going right back to where it was in 1975, right? And it's really sad for me. So election fraud, anyway, I got off on a tangent there. It happens everywhere, and it'll continue happening. I don't know how much it really has to do with illegal aliens. It might, because there seems to be some smoke out there that's one of the reasons this is all occurring. But I can't change what happened in the past. If Trump won the election, I don't care at this point. He wasn't the president. We had Joe Biden for 4 years. What I do care about is what happens going forward. I don't really care about the ID thing. I think an illegal alien will figure out how to get an ID, and in a Democrat state, they're going to be able to vote. And so I really don't know that passing some bill is going to make that happen. And I also think, if you're going to change things, where now we can really maneuver through, have the federal government really control a lot that's going on in states. Well, then the Democrats can do that too, and they can, ask Harry Reid about that. If anyone wants to complain about who sits on the Supreme Court of the United States, they can go right to Harry Reid. Again, Google it. I'm not going to take the time to explain that here. But I will put in the plug for Rahm Emanuel, because he was a good mayor. I don't know him personally, but I know he's probably a little rough around the edges for a lot of people. But I think, what wouldn't have been accepted in 2015 is we're more than willing to take right now. And I think if he jumped into the 2028 presidential, election, threw his hat in, today he'd be the only adult in the room. He'd be the only adult on the Democratic ticket. I think he, along with David Axelrod, who I know is his friend and is a brilliant political mind, as far as running campaigns goes, they would be a serious threat to the Republicans. Now, what I think the biggest problem with that is that I don't know if any of the Democratic PAC money or NGO money or big spenders in the Democratic Party are going to investigate a candidate who's not going to buy into the crazy, because I do not see Rahm Emanuel buying into the crazy, and I think most of us know what the far left crazy is, and if you can't get the money, you can't run for president. So that's my 2 cents on him, and that's my 2 cents on the presidency. But go from there.